Welcome back to Whispers of the Night, where stories are not rewritten but remembered differently. Tonight we open the window of a tower, not to rescue a princess, but to listen to the one who built the walls. You know her name. You were told to fear her. The witch, the kidnapper, the villain. But behind every monster is a wound. Behind every cage, a hand once meant to protect. This is not a tale of golden hair. This is a story of grief, of love twisted tight with fear, of a woman who held on so tightly she forgot what it meant to let someone choose. So dim the lights, sit still, and listen not for forgiveness, but for the truth that was never told. This is Rapunzel, as seen through the eyes of Gothel. They called her Gothel. Most said the name with contempt, as if saying it too sweetly might summon her. In the village, she was spoken of only in warnings. Don't stray too far past the woods. Don't look her in the eye. Don't steal from her garden. But no one ever asked who planted it. The garden bloomed at the edge of the forest like it didn't belong. Too alive, too strange, as if it had grown from a different world. And in many ways, it had. Rapunzel leaves, violet-veined and bittersweet. Silver root pulsing faintly at night. Thorn fruit that only opened for those who bled on it. Only Gothel knew their names. Only Gothel knew how to keep them alive. Because once, long ago, she had learned how to make things grow. She had not always lived alone. There had been a cottage once, smaller than her current one, but warm with laughter. A man who loved her. A daughter who bore her eyes. And then a fever came. The kind that didn't care how many spells you whispered or herbs you ground to paste. The kind that took without mercy. She had tried. Gods, she had tried. She had burned through every page of her grimoires, every drop of moonroot oil. She had begged the trees, the stars, the old gods who didn't answer anymore. But death did. And when it came, it took everything. After that, Gothel stopped begging. She moved deeper into the woods, built a garden not of beauty, but of control. Nothing would die here unless she allowed it. No leaf would wither unless she willed it. She became a myth. The villagers didn't see the grief curdled in her eyes. They only saw the robes, the silence, the way her garden bloomed even in winter. So they whispered and feared her and left her alone. And she accepted that, because if people don't love you, they can't leave you. She would have stayed forgotten too, until a man climbed her garden wall. It was spring when she saw him. He thought he was clever, slipping through the thorns at night. He thought the dew-covered footprints he left behind went unnoticed. But Gothel saw everything. She watched him pluck the Rapunzel leaves, delicate, glass-veined things growing only in the heart of her garden. She watched him pocket them and flee. The first time she said nothing. The second time she followed. He was younger than she expected. His hands were calloused, but not cruel. He moved like someone used to fear, always glancing behind him, holding his breath at every rustle. She followed him to the edge of the village, to a small crooked cottage, and then she saw her, the woman he brought the leaves to. Pregnant, pale, drenched in sweat, grasping his hands like he was the only thing tethering her to the world. Gothel stayed in the shadows, her heart suddenly heavier than it had been in years, not with anger, with ache. The third night! When he returned, she stepped from the trees. He froze. "Take one more leaf," she said, "and I will turn your bones into roots." He stammered, apologized, dropped to his knees. "My wife," he said. "She's dying, the child. She can't eat. She begs for the Rapunzel. It's all that helps." Gothel looked at him, looked through him, and saw herself, years ago, helpless, watching someone fade. She hated him for that, not because he stole, but because he reminded her what it felt like to hope and fail. Still, she did not strike him down. She offered a trade. "Take what she needs," she said, "but when the child is born, she is mine." His face collapsed, but he agreed. Of course he did. They always do when the need is great enough. He did not ask why. He did not see the flicker in her eyes when she said the words. He did not see that she was not collecting a debt. She was filling a hole. The child was born weeks later. He came to her trembling as if he expected her to arrive with fire and smoke. But Gothel came alone. No magic, no storm, only a small shawl in her arms. She did not take the child violently. She held her gently. The girl looked at her with eyes too wide, too new. Gothel felt something in her chest shift. A name rose in her throat before she could stop it. "Rapunzel," she whispered, "for the leaf that saved your life." and for the one it cost. She brought the girl back to the garden, not to curse her, not to twist her, but to keep her, to raise her in a world where no one could take her away, to be loved the way Gothel had once loved, fiercely, protectively, selfishly. She sang her lullabies of root and star, braided her hair with moonsap, told her stories of women who had lost everything and the girls who made them whole again. And she swore silently that no death would touch this child. Not while she still breathed. Not this time. In the village, they whispered of the stolen baby. They called her cursed, called Gothel a monster, but Gothel only smiled. Let them curse her name. She had Rapunzel now, and Rapunzel would never leave her. She would never outgrow her. She would never betray her. She would stay. Forever. Because this time, Gothel wasn't asking for love. She was building it, brick by brick, petal by petal, even if it meant keeping her daughter in a world that no one else could enter. Light and the weight of love. She named her Rapunzel, not just for the leaf that had started it all, but for the way the name curled on her, gentle, round, tender, for the way it sounded like something that might stay. And Rapunzel did stay. She stayed in Gothel's arms, in Gothel's cottage, in the garden of twisted vines and moonlit silence. She grew slowly, carefully, like a rare plant, watched and protected and watered with stories. Stories of the world outside, but only in fragments, only in shadows. Gothel taught her the names of plants before the names of people. She taught her to listen to the wind before she learned to speak. She taught her how to survive, not how to live. Because Gothel remembered what living had cost her before. Rapunzel was beautiful, more than Gothel had expected, more than she had prepared for. Her hair fell in rivers, gold soaked in light. Her skin seemed to hold morning. Her voice, when she sang, made even the thorns lean closer. Gothel didn't know how to feel about that. Pride, perhaps, or fear, because beauty was what had doomed the world outside. Beauty was currency there. Bait. A girl like Rapunzel would not be safe. Not out there. Not ever. At first it was simple. Rapunzel would play in the garden, chase shadows between the roots, hum songs made up from wind and water. Gothel would watch, brewing potions, weaving herbs into charm, pretending not to notice the way her heart clenched every time the girl laughed. She tried to be gentle. She tried to be kind. But fear has a way of curling around love until even the sweetest intentions grow teeth. When Rapunzel was 12, something shifted. It was in the way the girl looked at the horizon, how her eyes lingered too long on the sky, how her questions grew sharper, more pointed. Why do we never leave? Why can't I meet the people in the village? Why do they say your name like that? Gothel answered softly at first, because the world is cruel, because people destroy what they do not understand, because I lost once, and I will not lose again. But Rapunzel was not satisfied with fear. And Gothel knew, deep down, that no story would be enough forever. So she built the tower. It was not sudden. It was not even meant to be cruel. It was a monument of desperation, a place the world could not touch, a cage lined with love. She told Rapunzel it was for her safety, and Rapunzel, still young enough to believe in the goodness of adults, nodded and followed. At first it was like before. They brought books, music, food. Gothel wove spells into the stone, made the place glow warm in winter and cool in summer. Birds sang at the windows, vines crept lovingly up the walls, but the tower did not move, and Rapunzel began to see it for what it was. She never screamed, never raged. It was subtler than that. She sang less. She stopped asking questions. She stared out the window with a silence so loud it shook Gothel to her core. But Gothel would not bend, because bending meant breaking, and she could not bear to lose Rapunzel. Not to the world, not to dreams, not to the same hole that had swallowed her daughter before. Gothel told herself this was love. This love, wasn't it? Love was protecting. Love was shielding. Love was building a world where nothing could hurt the person you loved. Even if it meant they hurt alone. Even if it meant they grew afraid of the very hands that fed them. Sometimes Gothel watched her sleep. She would sit beside the window, fingers buried in golden hair, and wonder when the child had become a stranger, when her laughter had become rare, when her eyes stopped looking at her and only looked through her. And still, she stayed. Still, she climbed the tower every day, calling Rapunzel, let down your hair. Still, Rapunzel obeyed. because she didn't know how not to, because she loved Gothel too, just differently now. In the evenings, Gothel would brush her hair, long, slow strokes, like a ritual, like penance. "You're my light," she would whisper. Rapunzel never answered, but she didn't pull away. And that, Gothel told herself, was enough. She never thought of it as control. She called it care. She never thought of it as a prison. She called it safety. She never thought of it as fear. She called it love. Because sometimes love and fear wear the same mask. Because sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones trying hardest to keep us safe. Gothel remembered the way her own daughter had slipped through her fingers, taken by something she couldn't fight. She remembered the silence that followed, the hollow in her chest that never filled. She had promised herself she would never feel that again. She had sworn she would never bury another child, and so she trapped this one in a tower built of tenderness and grief. She believed with all her heart that this time this one would stay, even if she had to make her. The prince, a threat to her world, it began with a song. Not a spell, not a scream, just a simple melody drifting from the tower window, quiet as breath. Gothel had heard Rapunzel sing 1,000 times, but this was different. This song wasn't for her. It happened while she was away, out in the forest, gathering bloodroot and dusk moss for a fever spell no one had asked her for. She returned at dusk, arms full, only to pause at the base of the tower. The air was different. Not cold, not hot, just full. As if something invisible had shifted, cracked open. Rapunzel's voice floated down like a ribbon, soft, unguarded, threaded with something Gothel hadn't heard in years. Hope, but not the kind Gothel had given her. The kind she had warned her about. The kind that belonged to others. She climbed. "Rapunzel, let down your hair." The rope of gold unfurled like always. But the girl waiting above wasn't the same. She smiled too quickly, hid something in the folds of her dress. And for the first time, she didn't meet Gothel's eyes. The signs were subtle at first, a new softness in Rapunzel's cheeks, a blush that hadn't come from sun or warmth. She hummed to herself more, stared out the window longer, and once, only once, Gothel found a flower beneath the bed. Fresh, from the valley, not her garden, not hers. Gothel said nothing, not at first. She watched, counted the days, measured the air, until finally she stayed behind after the hair was let down. She waited in the trees, still as bark, breath shallow.
And then he came. He was young.
Of course he was. Handsome, in the effortless way of people who never had to earn kindness. His clothes were rich but worn, his hair too perfect, his eyes full of something that made Gothel's stomach twist. Wonder. He called up. She watched Rapunzel lower her hair. And when he climbed, Gothel did not scream. She waited, because rage was easy. But she wanted to understand what she was about to destroy. Inside the tower, they laughed. She could hear it through the stone. It was a sound she hadn't heard from Rapunzel in years, and it gutted her. Not because it was joy, but because it wasn't meant for her. That night, she said nothing. The next day, she said nothing. But on the third day, Rapunzel made a mistake. A small one, a question. "Mother Gothel," she said, "why is it that my dress feels tight these days?" And that was all it took. Gothel's hands went still. Her heart roared, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. Because she remembered what it meant to lose something that had grown inside you. Because she knew that even magic couldn't stop what came next. She didn't scream, didn't weep. She packed food, clothes, herbs, and then she cut the hair. It fell in a golden heap. Rapunzel gasped, reached for her head like it had been struck. But Gothel only held her shoulders. "I'm not punishing you," she said. "I'm protecting you." But the words felt hollow, even in her own mouth. She sent Rapunzel into the desert, not with curses, with blankets, with water, with spells woven into her sleeves to keep her warm at night. "Run far enough," she thought, "and maybe you'll be safe. Safe from him, from the world, from me." She did not say goodbye, because goodbye felt too much like surrender. Then she waited. She didn't have to wait long. The prince came the next evening, calling, climbing, smiling like he'd won, and Gothel met him at the top. He didn't have time to scream. She pushed him, not hard, just enough. He fell into the thorns. She heard him cry out, and then silence. She didn't check if he was dead. She didn't care. He had taken something from her, a light she had fought too hard to keep. He wasn't a hero, he was a thief. not of gold, not of spells, but of hope. She returned to the tower, alone again. She swept the floor, tended the fire, tied the hair into a bundle and buried it beneath the garden. She told herself this was right, that Rapunzel was safer now. That love, true love, didn't mean letting someone walk away. It meant keeping them safe. Even if they never thanked you for it, even if they never came back. But as night fell, the silence crept in again. Colder this time, sharper. And for the first time in years, Gothel wondered, was she still trying to protect her daughter, or just punishing the world for taking the first one? The tower was quieter than it had ever been, and Gothel had known many kinds of silence. The hush of early morning when the dew hadn't yet broken, the silence of a fevered child's breath slipping away, the silence people gave her in the streets, part fear, part disgust, part forgetting. But this silence was different. It had shape, weight. It pressed against her lungs like water. She stayed, after Rapunzel was gone, after the prince had fallen, after the golden hair was buried beneath the roots of her once sacred garden. She stayed, moved through the tower as if Rapunzel was still there, set out 2 cups, folded extra blankets, hummed lullabies without thinking. Each day bled into the next, colourless, each hour bent inward. She told herself Rapunzel would return. One day she had left her alive, with food, with spells, with protection. Hadn't she? But days passed, then weeks, and the only voice in the tower was her own. And even that she began to stop trusting. At night she lay in Rapunzel's bed, just to be near the scent of her hair still caught in the pillow. Sometimes she dreamt of the girl laughing, dancing through the garden like she used to, her golden braid trailing behind her like a tether. Sometimes in the dream, Gothel would reach for her, but Rapunzel wouldn't turn around, wouldn't look back. And that was the worst part. She wasn't angry, she was just gone. Gothel stopped tending the garden. The plants withered, the Rapunzel vines turned brittle. Without purpose, even magic loses interest. The tower had never been a prison, not to Gothel. It had been a sanctuary, a second chance, a way to grow something that couldn't be taken from her. But now, walking its spiral staircase felt like pacing the ribs of a dead thing. She stopped lighting candles, let the dust gather, let the birds nest in the windowsills. She began to talk to herself, not the way lonely people do, but the way people talk when they're trying to rewrite a memory. She was safe here. She never asked to leave. She loved me. She said so. She would have died out there. But none of the words softened the ache in her hands. The ache of no longer holding something fragile and warm. She wondered, had she loved Rapunzel, or had she only loved what Rapunzel gave her, the illusion of purpose? The comfort of control, a replacement for a daughter who had vanished into smoke. Had she raised a girl, or had she cultivated a symbol, a living monument to the things she had once failed to save? One morning, she caught a reflection in the window. It startled her, not because of the wrinkles or the grey, but because of the eyes. How empty they looked, how desperate. She left the tower for a day, walked the edges of the woods, tried to breathe where the air was cleaner, tried to remember what it had felt like once, to live without being afraid of loss. But even the trees seemed to flinch from her now. The world had moved on, and she hadn't. She returned to the tower because there was nowhere else to go. Because sometimes, even when the house is burning, it's still the only home you've known. And as she sat in the dark, surrounded by echoes and dust and all the things she couldn't hold on to, she finally let herself ask, not, was I right? Not, did she love me? But,
Did I ever let her be real?
because love, if built on fear, becomes a mirror. And Gothel had spent too many years looking at Rapunzel only to see herself. The tower was not a fortress, it had always been a cage, not for Rapunzel, for Gothel. Gothel watches for the world has a way of moving on without you. You can bury yourself in towers, in gardens, in grief. You can weave your days into rituals so tight that you forget how to breathe without them. But outside seasons turn, stories continue, even the ones you tried to control. Gothel heard of Rapunzel again through whispers, not from spells, not from spirits, but from people. The old woman from the apothecary who passed by her forest trail, the shepherd's boy who wandered too close to the garden gate, the maid who didn't realise who she was speaking to. They spoke of a girl in the desert, A golden-haired woman with a childlike voice and a gaze like sunlight trapped in glass. They spoke of a blind man who wandered through the dust, calling a name with such devotion that even the crows grew quiet to listen. They spoke of a reunion. She said nothing when she heard it, just stood still. Hand frozen around a dying vine, heart not breaking, but folding in on itself like a crumpled letter never sent. Rapunzel had survived. Of course she had. She had always been stronger than Gothel gave her credit for, gentler too. She had survived the wilderness, the loneliness, the heartbreak. She had even survived Gothel. They said her tears healed the prince, that when they met again, blind and broken, her sorrow turned into light, that they embraced like no time had passed, that they walked away together toward a kingdom that was ready to love them both. Gothel didn't cry, she didn't curse, she didn't call down storms or summon fire, she just sat in the center of her withered garden, among the roots of what once had been. She tried to feel happy. Wasn't this what she had wanted? For Rapunzel to live, to be safe, to find something better than a tower? And yet, she felt like a page torn from a book. The kind no one notices is missing until the ending doesn't make sense. She wondered if Rapunzel ever thought of her, not kindly, not with love. That was too much to ask, but just thought of her, of the lullabies, of the garden, of the hands that brushed her hair and whispered, "You are my light." She would never know. Rapunzel would not return. There would be no letters, no visitors, no reckoning. Only this quiet, only this absence. For the first time in years, Gothel ventured into the village, wrapped in plain cloth, hood low. People looked but didn't recognise her, or pretended not to. She passed the church, the baker, the fountain. She watched the children play without fear, watched lovers speak without shame. She saw the world that had never made room for her, now spinning perfectly without her. She heard Rapunzel's name again in the market, not with malice, with wonder, with softness. The girl in the tower had become a myth, a miracle. The witch, barely a footnote, a shadow too bitter to remember. Gothel went home, back to the garden, back to the silence, and for once she didn't fight it. She whispered a name into the soil, softly, like a prayer she no longer believed in. Not Rapunzel, not her lost daughter, just herself. Trying to remember who she had been before the grief, before the tower, before the world had told her she was too much and not enough all at once. She sat in that stillness for a long, long time, watching, not the world, but the space it left behind. There was no ending carved for Gothel, no gallows, no flames, no sword through the heart, no triumphant return of the young and good. There was only time, and what it left behind. She lived, not as a ghost, not as a curse, just as a woman growing old in a place the world had already forgotten. The tower stood empty, the vines climbed but bore no fruit. The garden, once so alive with forbidden colour, dulled into earth-toned quiet. Rapunzel never came back, and Gothel never expected her to. What would she say if she did? Would she rage? Would she forgive? Would she even recognise the woman who once held her so tightly she mistook the grip for love? Gothel didn't need answers anymore. Some questions weren't meant to be closed, some wounds don't scar clean. She grew quieter with the years. Not in bitterness, but in fatigue. There were no spells left to cast, no lessons to teach, no illusions left to protect. Sometimes children whispered near the edge of the woods. About the witch who used to steal babies, about the tower no one could find anymore, about the woman who grew magic from her fingertips. They said she was evil, they said she was dead, they said she had turned into a tree, and maybe in some way all of it was true, because Gothel had become something else now. Not villain, not victim, just memory, half told, mistranslated, left behind like a seed never watered. She never knew if Rapunzel spoke of her, if the stories gave her a name, if the girl, now a woman, now a mother perhaps, ever whispered that name into her children's hair as she braided it gently, fingers trembling from a past she couldn't fully recall. That was the legacy. Not towers, not spells, not even the pain, but the imprint, the invisible shape of a woman too afraid to lose, and so she clutched too hard. The echo of a love that could not let go. People think monsters are made from cruelty, but some are made from tenderness stretched too thin, from grief that festers, from love that forgets to open its hand. Gothel died one winter morning, quietly, unnoticed. She lay in the cold soil of her garden, face turned toward the pale sky, as if listening for something that never arrived. No one came. No one wept. No one buried her. And yet, something of her remained. They say that deep in the woods, there is still a patch of earth where nothing grows except one flower, a single stalk of Rapunzel, blooming out of season, beautiful, bitter, and impossible to touch.
Reflection!
Gothel's ending is not one of justice or redemption. It is a quiet reckoning with the fact that some wounds are passed down not in curses but in silence, that those who hurt us were once hurting too, and that sometimes we don't become monsters, we become lonely.